Corey, good afternoon. How you doing?
Pretty great. How are you, Ryan?
Doing good, man. Glad we got connected through our awesome YEC network, and we've also got some fun mutual connections that'll be interesting as this story surfaces. But you got a pretty cool story, and you reached out, and we're more than happy to share on the show, which I'm excited to hear some of the inner workings of what you've done so far. But for the listeners that don't know you or your background, can you give us a little bit of background on how is it that you became an entrepreneur? What was the set of circumstances that you found yourself running a business?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I guess, track into becoming an entrepreneur was a complete accident, which apparently is a pretty common story in the space.
Isn't it funny?
Yeah, like I think I always knew I would do something, but it kind of took me by surprise, right? So I grew up around family businesses. I always thought, I can tinker, I can do this, right? Like I could watch my dad fix appliances and run simple businesses, I could do it too. But in my case, I started a web hosting company in 2004, and it's everyone was doing it back then. I think it's a stretch to say it was a web hosting company because you could go to GoDaddy, you could spend $5, and they let you host a couple extra accounts, right? So it grew very, very quickly and by accident until, I don't know. I mean, we can dig into the story here, but I ended up taking on more partners, merging with other businesses. It got big and grew into this wild hydra of brands before I finally just said enough and just wiped the slate clean in 2010.
And I think that's interesting because I would say probably a good chunk of our listeners that totally get the web hosting and some of them that don't. So how exactly, with you growing that fast, how were you growing that fast, and what were the actual services that you're providing?
Yeah. So at the beginning, it was just web hosting. You've got a website, some local businesses, the coffee shop that I hung out in, just people from around. That doesn't generate a ton of revenue, right? It's spending $5 to make $5 a month each time. So there were quite a few pivots as we were growing that business that I guess today they'd call it growth hacking. I think it's kind of a stupid description of just looking for opportunity and kind of adjusting your business for it. I do SEO and inbound marketing now, but even though that was central, I think at every stage of the game, it was really those shifts in vision for the business as a whole that I probably deserves the majority of the credit. And then it's just kind of what we did with it. So we started out doing regular web hosting, and it grew into the whole suite of services that were related, but in IT, like you can do that. So there were rent out whole servers to people or just sell them some bandwidth. So there was a lot going on there.
Well, and I think it's such an interesting ability as you're just selling one services to pivot because you got the customer base that you've got sitting at your fingertips. And were you guys actually, purchasing servers and then putting them on site, or were you just relicensing and supporting the people originally? Or how did you actually end up getting into that particular space?
Well, after a while, we were. So we realized after a bit. So after about a year, I took on my first partner. And one thing we realized pretty quickly was we would much rather rent out dedicated servers to people. Instead of $5 or $10 a month, they cost $200-$300 a month. Some people pay a lot more than that, especially if they use a lot of bandwidth. There's certain applications for a server that use a lot more bandwidth than just hosting a website, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So we spent a lot of time on chat forums at first, and we realized, hey, we have this guy who's actually got a pretty good deal on this in Chicago. He's a terrible communicator, a really nice guy. So we can kind of lead the charge for him. We can sell his product or resell it instead of just going from GoDaddy like everybody else, right? So that takes off, and before too long, we filled a whole cabinet of servers, doing pretty well. And I'm actually starting to consider leaving my part-time job at the time. That continues to grow. We get approached by a data center in Cedar Falls, Iowa, called Team Technologies, that said, you know what, we see what you're doing. We have this brand new facility. We need somebody to fill it. So they pull us in there, and And this is something that people who aren't really in the telecom world are probably familiar with, but not all bandwidth is created equal, right? Like most people just get their local internet from Comcast or whatever
Hmm.
now. But on the data center side, there were a lot of providers, and some of them are considered really bottom barrel. At the time, it was a company called Cogent. Nobody wanted to touch Cogent. They would go out of their way to make sure if they rented a server, it didn't have Cogent. Obviously, we were renting out Cogent bandwidth in our first business. In Mass,
Everybody, I love it.
it was cheap, and
Right.
they just had a bad reputation. They just kind of had they cut some corners, maybe. I don't know. But this facility that approached us was on the absolute polar end of the spectrum. They were licensing internet bandwidth, which was, if that could be more opposite, it was, and it
Hmm.
was really expensive to get it. But what they told us was, we've got all this bandwidth and nobody to use it. We need somebody to fill our commitments and ramp this up really quickly. So obviously we said yes. We drove out to Cedar Falls. We got everything set up there. It was amazing. It was amazing for us anyway. It seemed like it was for them. We filled up a whole bunch of racks of servers in their facility. We didn't have a contract. This is just month to month. They just had all this excess capacity to fill. We were doing a great job of filling it until one day they said, "You guys have to get out of here in 2 weeks."
Oh my
So
gosh. How, well, wow. First of all, I'm sure there's some, let's peel that back because there's some other stuff I
sure.
want to make sure we go back to too. But like, so what was the time frame that you guys were in that data center?
So that was at maybe our first couple of years, and that really jump started things, I think.
Okay. So maybe let's take that in chunks. I mean, go back to, so, Corey, why did you actually end up getting a partner, that first partner that you had? Was there a reason? Was there skill sets? Did he provide funding or different kind of expertise or something?
Sure. Well, the deal was he would run the servers. That got me off of GoDaddy.
Okay. Got it.
But I was the marketer. I was the growth person, basically, in the equation.
Did you guys like, was there any kind of way you valued the business then, or was it just like, hey, like handshake deal, I'm going to give you some equity, and we're going to split, sweat and labor, time and materials stuff, or how it was there any kind of formal way that you guys went about it?
It was pretty casual. We registered an LLP
Okay.
at that point. I don't think we even had an operating agreement. It was pretty crude. We had like a joint bank account for the business, and that was it. It wasn't something that either of us even saw as a business yet. I think it was more of a hobby.
So when did it become a business in your eyes?
Well, at that point, I guess by the time we moved into team technologies, it was looking like, okay, this is going to grow into something that is going to be a long-term project. This isn't just kind of screwing around on the internet anymore like I've done my whole life.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and it still wasn't a full-time thing. It was probably not until 2007 when we ended up merging with a client of ours. And I took on 2 more business partners that we took the whole thing full-time.
So is that after the data center arrangement, and then you guys got the boot?
It was immediately after, actually. So we got the boot. We ended up coming into a situation. We moved back to Chicago. We moved into a facility with Steadfast Networks here. They're actually a client of our agency even now. So I've had a really good relationship with them ever since. They've never kicked me out of their data center. All around good people. So yeah, we ended up merging with a client of ours, and they did Ventrilo hosting, which isn't even an industry anymore, I don't think. And I don't know if you're familiar. I think most people won't be.
Yeah, I'm not actually.
I barely was. It was a huge industry at the time, though, where basically, we're using Zoom to do a podcast right now.
Mm-hmm.
There are a million different options for audio chat.
Mm-hmm.
You've got Skype, you've got, 10 million, and half of them are free. At the time, it wasn't the case. And this was a really niche thing, specifically for kids playing World of Warcraft. It's big in all of the esports, but mostly it was all about World of Warcraft, where you'd have a guild of 50 kids all on one chat.
Oh my gosh.
And they needed a way to kind of control it, right? You can't have 50 people talking at once. So again, it was very niche and nuanced, and they would all throw in. In fact, the company developed an application just called Guild Pay, so they could all like throw in $1. And they would all have this, $50 a month server.
Hmm.
It was a huge thing, and it had grown explosively for them. We were their supplier in one city, but they decided that they wanted to grow into 6 different cities. They didn't have good vendors in those locations. They also recognized that if they did have a little bit more control of their infrastructure, somebody that could rent them really high bandwidth servers like we were doing, that they would get a cut of that too. And it was just better all around, right?
Well, right, and yeah, it's such an interesting landscape because it kind of taken me back, and probably a lot of other people, and all the how fragmented it all was. And if can we go back? I'm just kind of curious on like the
Yeah.
data center part. So were you in there for a few years, or like what was the time frame that you said you were in that?
So 2005 to 2007.
So did your revenues just skyrocket? Because so explain to the listeners, because they built it and they thought people were going to come and you were the traffic, right? So it made sense on the outside, right? And how did your revenues change, and did you have to build an infrastructure to support what that volume brought? And then did that lead into you needing to merge or you wanting to merge?
Oh, I see. So after the merger, what happened?
No, no, no. So I'm thinking like, with the team technologies, the data center in Cedar Rapids.
Hmm.
Did so you didn't have a contract with them, I think, which is a lot of times people struggle with that, is they're growing their companies and these opportunities kind of fly at them, and they don't realize the ramifications as things go south or they get kicked out, right?
Sure.
So did the original data center engagement change like your revenue structure, and did it spike revenues, and did you have to build an infrastructure so when they said, hey, you got to leave, they kind of precipitated the talks with merging with that client of yours?
I don't think so. It came afterwards enough to where I would say they were unrelated. But
Okay.
that time in Iowa, I think, did grow our business significantly because it gave us a better product. We were able to just pop in front of new eyeballs and say, hey, look at what we've got here. Like, this is really, it's a lot of bandwidth, but it's high end bandwidth, which that was a value proposition that no one else could really replicate at the time.
And then your client came, what actually triggered the merge then? Was it something that they obviously needed the services, or what did they bring to the table that you wouldn't have just kept them as a client?
Well, they were a bigger company, for one, uh, significantly so. But they also saw that their market was trending downwards while ours was trending upwards. So I think everybody got something different out of the merger. And I still to this day kind of question what everyone's motives were at the time. But there were definite pros all over the map. In my partner and I's case, we were quitting our part time jobs, right?
Hmm.
It means that this company is big enough and has enough streams of revenue to where we feel pretty good going all in with this. It also meant that we could expand our lines of business in a new way, and we had a new value proposition which actually fit beautifully with our name, which was Ubiquiti. The word means that you exist everywhere. Our tagline was everywhere always, but we weren't everywhere. We were just in Chicago. So the way that we got around that was we took all of the servers they were renting in Seattle, Los Angeles, Dallas, Atlanta, and New York, and we put them into Ubiquiti facilities, we called them. So we ended up moving them into co-located data centers on our own equipment in each of these markets, and we started selling a solution that allowed any provider to do this. So people like CDNs were just springing up at the time. People with content delivery networks. You've got game server providers, you've got voice over IP providers that all have a reason to have a lot of high quality bandwidth in multiple cities. I think after this, a company that IBM acquired called SoftLayer was maybe the second company I saw have this same business model. And obviously they did it bigger and better than we did. But I think there was something to it.
Well, I think it kind of shows how fragmented the services were, and it was the customers and the needs that were driving the kind of the situations like you had. So they
Mhm.
brought all the equipment, and you were bringing that you were bringing the servers and the bandwidth. Did they have like a bunch of assets? So like when you guys merged together, how did you guys value it? How did you guys separate the equity and the partnerships? Did they have
Sure.
assets and you had customers? I'm just kind of curious when you take two different business models like that that are trending in different directions. How did that whole thing get structured?
Not as professionally or elegantly as you're probably hoping to hear. We literally just split it up four ways. Uh, so four equal parts, and there wasn't much science. I think it's through just the utter chaos of it all that I think it kind of worked out. Uh, Eventually, like Ubiquiti did become a bigger company than Darkstar, the company that we merged into. But at the time, it sure didn't look that way. So for me, yeah, like I'm going to have share of a much larger company. That looks pretty good. And I think for them, it was, well, this company's not even probably going to exist in a couple of years. So I want one that looks like it's going to stick around, and we have a way to kind of build that. So again, everybody kind of expected something different, but it was so chaotic. Like I don't think any of us went through the thought process of just trying to come up with a reasonable valuation.
What would you have done differently starting there now that you've kind of gone through it?
Uh, I don't think I would have done too much differently, only because I don't know the answer there, and maybe you have some ideas of what could have happened there. But in our case, I mean, we had an operating agreement, and the one thing that ended up saving everything when everything kind of melted down later, we added one line to the operating agreement that wasn't like boilerplate, which was just simply if any partner spends more than I think like $100, which to us seemed like a lot of money at the time, that they have to get everybody else's approval, which just meant that, yeah, we've got this big multi-headed hydra of a lot of partners, just make sure everybody is in agreement on where we're going. That was something that I think it wasn't as respected or organized as we grew. And there's maybe not the equity share, but a lot more just operationally, I think that would be more where I would have looked.
Well, I think the operating agreement is something that a lot of people don't put a ton of weight on until they realize that it's not as tight as they needed it to be when they have disagreements and how
Definitely.
and as you guys continued, what was the main vision as you guys so you split it all four ways, and it was kind of like you said through the chaos and all the different motives. What was the vision? Did you guys have like a bigger vision of what you were trying to accomplish, and how did you guys like start planning for the future? Was there any kind of end in mind, or what was some of the major milestones that you guys hit as a group?
Nobody discussed them aloud. And I guess if there's one thing that I would have done differently, it probably would have been that. So I think everyone had a different end in mind. We had one partner who he loved his lifestyle. He would have kept it going, never even dreamed of exiting. And we had another that just, buying sports cars. That was it. And, another still that was like, I'm going to flip this company in a year. I'm going to go to work for somebody else. And I mean, we were all young too. Like I was still in college while this was going on. So I think that's something that it's very important now that like if you have multiple partners that they are in absolute agreement of where are we going. We didn't have that.
So how did that impact, like, in which it is so common, Corey? I mean, like, even big companies where everybody has got different motives and it's never been talked about what people want. And so how did that how did that impact your decisions on what you were going to spend? I mean, I'm assuming the sports cars were on the personal bucket because it's probably more than $100. But like, how did that impact like your strategic vision and how you're doing investing in the back into the business? Because I think, I'm assuming, was there tension and conflict as you guys were going through that?
Well, we still basically had two partners. We were basically two companies. So we had two partners running Darkstar. We had two partners running Ubiquiti. There was a little bit of crossover, and that is obviously where it started to get a little weird. But it was a decent system. Having two partners with equal say can be a challenge when you don't have a tiebreaker. I think that was something that, as we reached the end of my time there, it became more of a thing, and I think that's something that could go better. But operationally, it was just day by day, and we hoped that we reached an agreement. And it became even less about the partners because only myself and my original partner worked out of the same office with most of our staff. So we would usually pull in staff and get their opinions, but then it becomes political, right? It's well, this is your staff member, so they know where their bread gets buttered or whatever. So
Mhm. What was the org structure like? I mean, like, what kind of staff did you have at that point?
Well, we had 25 full-time people in total near the end there. So in a web hosting company, or really any service company, it's mostly support, um,
Hmm.
answering tickets. We had 5 people dedicated to facilities in each city, just doing on-site work, and one person leading each of those teams. So a head of support and a head of facilities. And the rest were outliers. We had like a network administrator and a salesperson.
Yeah, which in that time too is, I'm assuming a lot of those people are very hard hires to find with that kind of skill set that can communicate and do that. I kind of had some of the same labor pool I was trying to pull from, and it's always a main very difficult challenge.
Completely homegrown. One of our people actually came from being homeless into, uh,
Shut up.
no joke.
How did
Uh,
you find him?
we didn't. He was actually he was close with one of the partners that was on the other side, on the Dark Star side. So yeah, that's just kind of how it went.
Crazy.
Like it had just kind of thrown him some work on the internet, just freelance. Realized like, hey, like they're really into this, like they're reliable and they're passionate about it. So just kept teaching them, and yeah,
Crazy. That's awesome. That's a
good
really cool
employee.
story.
It, it definitely goes against any type of anything you hear about HR or whatever, but it worked out.
That's awesome. Yeah, a lot different than trying to pick off the MBA or MBA people that are like, automatically asking for a bunch of money and have no experience because it never worked in the working environment before.
Totally.
So, did you guys like? What was the major milestones that you're marching towards? Did you have client contracts? How did you? I mean, were you measuring EBITDA? What were like the judging KPIs that you were measuring as you guys were growing?
So we had a few events as years passed after the merger where people did offer to buy us. That was actually where all of us learned for the first time, I think, about the EBITDA model and how businesses get valued. But I think in our case, it wasn't even very flattering because our margins in that business were razor thin. And I think that's just the nature of hosting. It's like, can I offer an account for $4 instead of $5? Well, I'm going
Hmm.
to do it then. And that makes that world a little bit tricky. So we had a few
How
offers, and that was just by whatever methods they threw at us, we kind of considered.
how did they come across you? I mean, and why were they actually knocking on your door?
Well, there was a few, and I think I've got to be careful there because I think there were probably NDAs or something.
Mhm.
But it was just different synergies, sort of like what put us together with the partner that we merged with, where people were developing technology on the game hosting side. It was
Mhm.
interesting. Just people were coming up with different solutions. Like esports has just taken off, so we had people developing different network services, that sort of thing, which was very attractive. We also, on the Ubiquiti side, it's all about economies of scale when you get into data centers. So just like Team Technology has just kind of used us for a little bit to up their bandwidth numbers until they could get a really high paying customer in there. That mentality is pretty key. We got another offer from somebody who ran a merchant provider. They said, well, wow, like Darkstar, like 20,000 clients, Ubiquiti had thousands as well. So the fact that you have a whole lot of small transactions means that would be great for my fees. That's leverage for me. Just if you use my payment processor.
Mm.
So everyone kind of had their own angle.
Interesting.
Mhm.
Did you like as you were going through these different? Then when you say that you got these offers, did you go through like full due diligence? And so maybe the context I'm asking this inquiry is that I think a lot of entrepreneurs in the circles that we run into, or any of them, they these offers come flying out of the blue, whether it's from strategic buyers or investors or whatever, and they're
Yep.
crazy distracting because people go through different links or different, like how long they go through the process before they realize it's not a fit. I mean, did you learn anything? How far did you go down before you started, actually getting the offers?
Yeah. So we did some basic diligence for a few people. It was enough to, I guess, firstly, make us really look at our bookkeeping practices a little bit more deeply. We ended up looking at, external bookkeepers for the first time ever. Had never really had a reason to do that, but people care about your financials, it turns out, when they're looking to spend an extreme amount of money to purchase you.
What were some of the things that you cleaned up, or that you found that you didn't have clean when you were getting questioned?
Uh, just the reporting in general, there was very, very little. We were, tracking one business bank account with a few business credit cards. Um, Obviously, we can show profit and loss there, but we didn't have a balance sheet. We didn't have it vetted by a third party, which was important to a few of the people we spoke with, anyway. So just having somebody audit it who is not a partner.
Yep. Did you, and then like other than the financials, I mean, did you, was it contracts? Was it like service agreements or other things that you were pulling up? And was it distracting for you and the partners as you're going through this while trying to run the business?
To an extent, yeah. It's not something that we got too deep into. I guess when we were fielding outside offers, but yeah, like every time a request comes in, that's one day that you're not working on growing the business. That you're working on just diving in and formatting things for people. So it factors in for sure.
How did your guys as a team, and with especially as you mentioned that you have four partners, but kind of you found out were different motives as you're starting to get a little bit of a taste of a different perspective of your business. How did perceptions change, or did you start to see different motives come out of that? I mean, was there revelations throughout some of these processes?
Yeah, I think that even more than the process there, like, yeah, it got everyone talking for sure, really for the first time. And we all kind of came up with our number, right? Like, guess, I don't know if I can say this on here. You've got the expression "fuck you money," right?
Yep. Right.
I'll let you
And what
edit
did
that
that
out.
mean? What did that mean to you? Because I think it means something different to everybody, but I'm curious because, yeah, I think there's a lot of entrepreneurs that's what we all want, and it means
Yeah,
differently to everybody.
sure. And to us, like, we were greedy. Like, we looked at it. It's like based on nothing at all. I'm like, I'll take 20 million. That's cool. Like, I can see we're explosive growth. We're going to be huge. Uh, and obviously, most buyers are just not going to go along with that. Uh, but that was our first thought. That was my first thought. Um, I had other partners that, it's like, well, I just want to get acquired, and I really want them just to put me on salary. I want to work for them, and to me, that sounds like the worst thing ever. I don't think I
Right?
can do that. Uh, like
Take
I've
all
never,
this risk and go work for someone.
yeah, exactly. So is that really the end game? And it certainly got all of us thinking in that regard, and everyone had a different answer.
How did you reconcile that?
We didn't. Uh, about a year later, I ended up selling my share and doing things my way. So yeah,
So how did you? Well, which I think is a channel you got, like you said, you call it the four-headed hydra. I think that's a pretty interesting way to describe it. Like, what were the conversations like? I mean, did the tension start to rise as you were starting to realize that everybody's got different motives? I mean, then like, how did you like? What did that do to the conversations and the dialogue with you and your partners?
right. Well, it turned into Game of Thrones, right? Like you've got four different partners with like four different, camps of staff that they've brought in. One partner had his whole family working for the company at one time. Uh, and everyone kind of had these allegiances. So it started to get really odd near the end. Like two partners were clear about wanting to get rid of another partner. And then I think I had conversations at one time or another with every single team member about getting rid of somebody else into somebody different
Oh
every
my gosh.
time. And it was really toxic, right?
What were the reasons to get rid of the people? Was it to increase EBITDA or just to try and to try and get ownership over the like what was the purpose?
It was different every time. We had one partner that I think was the first one that I started hearing about that was just, they said, well, we think he's kind of lazy. And the reality was he had actually written most of the company's systems. He was the one that was like, well, I'd love to be able to just do my thing and we'll run this forever, right?
Hmm.
He wasn't necessarily building towards something, but he was a developer. He liked to work third shift most nights. I don't think we usually saw most of what he did, and I don't think he was really into communicating it because he never really had to.
Hmm.
Now, looking back, I give him a lot of credit. I think he was a huge contribution to the company. But then we had other situations too. We had a data center made us an offer to move in. They offered us equity. I had one partner that said, "Well, we should cut out the other partner because we can in that deal and just move our stuff in there, but we'll start a new company and only we'll take the equity." It's like, well, that seems shady. I mean, we're using,
Right. A couple other words I could think of too.
yeah. So that conversation happened. Then, I had another one where, I think ultimately a conversation was had where I was on the other end of this too, that I never heard, but I had that flip side of, oh, I just don't think we need this many partners. So maybe we can kind of push them out. Maybe we can just, we'll cut their salary. It'll be our word against theirs. And yeah, what are they going to do? So
Oh man,
that
how are you coping with that?
badly. I was not sleeping much. It was awful. That was the year that the movie The Social Network came out. You remember with like Mark
Hmm.
Zuckerberg? You got that expression now. You Zuckerberg and me. I watched that. I thought it was a Disney movie. Like it was freaking like nothing compared to my life at the time, which was just a nightmare. So yeah, one day I got a letter in the mail. The company moved to a different state, uh, and I was getting looped into less and less as this was happening. And I'm not an idiot. I see like all these conversations have been happening for a year and a half now about different people every time. Like I know what people's motives are, which is just give me more. Uh,
Hmm.
and yeah, it's
Did you
like,
guys did like everybody well with all the different, you know, motives? What
mhm.
did you guys have like a dollar amount that you thought the company was worth that was worth all this crap? Or like was there enough to fight over? Or, you know, how did you I mean, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And yes, I think it was. And we had a dollar amount, actually a few different dollar amounts from people that had made us offers already. So that helped. It is some extra validation. It's not necessarily this is the model to value our company. And I'm not sure anyone ever actually gets that, right? Like everyone has different models and they say, well, we should use trailing 12 months or we should use last 3 years. But people kind of negotiate that way in what I've seen. But we had a few offers and I think that kind of set the basis.
What were the ways that they ended up valuing your company?
I don't even know. Uh, it The original offer, we were introduced to the EBITDA, which I think just must have been a incredible multiplier because our margins were just super, super slim. So I think it was just closer to gross revenue is what we came down to.
Well, and I'm assuming based on your old industry that because of the sheer quantity of customers that you have, it's a
Hmm.
strategic purchase because people want the access to those customers, and
Absolutely.
yeah, it's a little bit different than going off of a discounted cash flow or multiple of EBITDA because people can make money so fast if they had that customer list.
Yeah, it's the customer list, it's the contract leverage too.
And can you expand on that?
Sure. So when you run a data center, let's say you purchase bandwidth from AT&T. They're a provider most people probably know. You pay a rate that gets calculated per megabit per second. So that's completely changed now, or it's become a lot more efficient. You might have 100 megabit per second from Comcast, right?
Hmm.
A data center will have gigabits per second or 10 gigabits per second in larger increments. And they call it a commitment. So they have ramp pricing where they say, okay, if you buy 10 gigabits from us, you get this price per megabit. If you buy more, it gets cheaper. And you use your economies of scale that way. It for bandwidth, you do it for space in facilities, you do it for purchasing hardware, pretty much across the whole spectrum of IT. The bigger you are, the easier it is to play. So it really, really rewards economies of scale.
I mean, the Amazon model through and through, right?
Pretty much.
So, when you've got going back to the partnership stuff, how are you? So, as you're, struggling with this emotionally and you got these dollar amounts and the toxic warfare going on internally, I mean, what way did you see out of that? I mean, I'm assuming you're racking your brain every single night, making, as you're going through scenarios, what are the scenarios that you thought of, that you thought through and then what happened when you finally had enough?
Well, it reached a point where I couldn't get my business partners to speak to me, couldn't get them to answer messages. The right way to deal with it would have just been to have a conversation, but I couldn't get that to happen. You mentioned the idea of were people buying sports cars with their personal money? No, a couple of them went on the company credit card too, near the end here, and
No.
it was getting messy. So Finally, they moved the office to a different state. I'm not involved in that conversation at all, which is pretty crazy. My office shares a wall with one of my partners in the months leading up to that.
Oh my gosh.
I think the reason was specifically so they didn't have to have conversation with me. Like, this was not something that they wanted to look me in the eyes after doing. And it's awful, but that was the situation we were in. Like, they avoided any conversation about this until the company moved to Arizona. I get a letter from someone's real estate attorney that had like 3 bullet points in it. It said your salary is, been reduced from like a nice 6-figure salary to like 20 grand a year. You still have health benefits, the second one, which I think legally they have to at that point. And the third bullet point was, you do not require access to any of the company's systems to do your job.
What the heck?
Yeah, 3 bullet point letter. And
Oh my
it's
God, your
crazy.
blood must have been boiling.
Yeah. Especially when considering I wrote most of the systems that I was being locked out of. It was my company. I was employee number one, even before I took in the second partner. In my mind, like, I registered the domain. They actually broke into my personal GoDaddy account and managed to socially engineer the domain away.
What was so off with you and them? Like, was it vision or what you were trying to do? I mean, like, what
It was
was?
greed. They had conversations about flipping it. I've heard from employees since then that they immediately were talking about flipping it, that, in the weeks after they moved to Arizona. But they thought that if they got me out, I think that they would be able to take the majority. And everybody thought they deserved more than somebody else for whatever reason, which, maybe that can be argued by somebody, but it was pretty rough. So I ended up finally getting a lawyer involved at that point. He said, normally I advise business partners to work this stuff out between each other. Like, it's going to get really expensive if you get lawyers involved. But in this case, I can see that you've been trying. Like, I can see all your emails and all your documentation to try to get them to talk to you, and they're not. So I do think you need to file a lawsuit to get their attention. But in the same breath, said, then I think we need to talk about settling, which I hadn't even thought about. And by settling, he said, I think you need to think about cashing out, which, yeah, like, this whole time up until that moment, the only thing in my mind was, there's got to be some way to fix this to get, people to be reasonable again. And, he was right. There was no putting it back together after that. There's no way that everybody sits down in the same office and is happy working with each other again. So that
Yeah,
ended up
that's
being
rough.
yeah, that was it.
So what was like, how did everything unfold there? I mean, I mean, did you settle? Did you go to court? How did you come up with what you were owed and how to get paid?
Yeah, so we settled. It happened pretty quick. We just exchanged emails.
No kidding. After all
Yep.
that,
After all of that. Yep.
did you take like one of the dollar amounts that you guys had gotten in the past and said, this is, a fourth of that and give it to me now? Or how did you work that out?
That was exactly how I approached the conversation. I just referenced an offer that we had before. I said, let's just give me 25% of that, and that's good. I'm happy then.
Did they agree on that?
On the second try, yeah, they kicked back no. I said yes, and then they said yes, and then
Did
yeah.
they cut you a check? I mean, I'm assuming if you're going to do that, you want like to literally cut ties so that way they can't screw with you anymore. I mean, did they go get financing? Did they have enough cash to write a check like that?
I don't think I'm allowed to talk about like the
Okay.
actual terms, but it ended up working out. I guess is all I can
Yeah.
say there.
Right. Well, which I think is just, for the listeners, I think it's just important too, because, and if you got anything, thing that you can actually disclose on this is just, there's a lot of situations, Corey, where it seems like they're going to get the money, but there's a lot of, oh yeah, I got you after the fact because of incorrectly written earnouts or promissory notes or employment contracts and stuff, that there's a lot of potholes that people need to be concerned about. So it's not just about like agreeing on a dollar amount, because there's a lot of other things to take into consideration.
Sure.
So, when you look back at going through all that, first of all, what did you do after that all got settled? I mean, did you like spend some time reflecting and like trying to figure it out, or you must have been emotionally beaten down. I mean, that's just, how did you work through that?
Yeah, I was. So I thought, I'm going to take some time off. I'm going to do some SEO on some websites. I'm just going to pretty much just live my life now in a way that is nothing like that. Which, the past couple of years, it got me thinking, like, what would be ideal here? It's certainly not politics in a company environment like that. So I ended up going to visit a friend of mine in the Caribbean. He's actually an archaeologist down there, and I ended up staying in this old fort with him for a couple of weeks. But I already had old competitors emailing me asking for help, specifically with SEO, because we were really, really good at SEO. So our old company ranked for Linux hosting and like all these other 2-word phrases. Like we were page 1 for just dedicated servers for a long time. And that was awesome. So I ended up taking a few consulting agreements. Those people started referring me business themselves, their own competitors. So we ended up I ended up building a company again by accident from that. And here I am. It's been, I guess, 7 years since all of that happened. And now I have a marketing agency, which is much more profitable than my first company. And I'm happy. I have no drama.
Do you have four? Let me ask you, do you have 4 partners?
I don't have 4 partners.
Wow. When you were sitting in the Caribbean and you were thinking about this stuff, or even over the last 7 years, Corey, because there's a lot of business owners that have partners and they get into it because there's random circumstances that they leverage each other and then they outgrow each other. Life happens and their outcomes and their desires change. When you were sitting there thinking about how you could have potentially did something differently, I mean, is there anything in the partnerships that you learned? Maybe not that you would have done differently, because you probably learned a lot and you've reflected on it. So is there anything that you learned from it that you did differently this time, or for the listeners, you would just say, hey, you know what? Here's how you approach something like that?
Oh, sure. So I did a lot differently. I think that all this stuff, you learn the most just by doing, in every manner of running a business. So I got a bookkeeper involved. I have really clean finances and everything's nice and organized. I do actually know how to value an agency now. I know that, like 3.5 times EBIT is pretty standard for where I'm at right now. I learned that really we should have been classified as an S corporation probably on the last go too. So I figured that out too, just the different advantages of structuring a business. So yeah, everything's all new, and it's amazing. Like I never would have expected I would have been right back where I was at the time. It was like, like the world was ending, but somehow everything ended up better for it.
With your agency now, are you like looking to the end in mind, knowing at least what your options are at any given point? Because it sounds like you're actually running a good scorecard where you've got some valuations, and you kind of always looking at the landscape and looking towards what your options might be compared to just kind of going day to day like you were before.
Well, yeah, of course. I'm happy where I am, but I think you definitely have to look out for just opportunity. I've had similar conversations in this business, which I think is a good sign. None that have been really where I want to be, but I can at least project, hey, you know what? If I hit a number, I hit a scale, or if whatever reason, life throws me a curveball and just like I don't love doing this anymore, like I absolutely know the way out.
Mm-hmm. I'm assuming, how are you with the people that you were surrounded with before versus now? Is there certain things that you do with your clients or your employees or partnerships or something like that to make sure that you really like the people? Because I think there's a lot of people that out there that get into relationships that they didn't mean to, or they like put up with crap that they don't wish. How are you? Your quality scale must be pretty high. How do you go through that personally?
Yeah, that was really important to me actually, as I started to research just what makes people unhappy with their job, because I was pretty unhappy at the end there with my last business. And the thing that tops just about every list is interference in people's personal lives. And I found that was pretty true. I was losing a lot of sleep near the end. I was worrying about, what move is someone else going to pull, and what am I going to have to do to make that right. And the first decision I made was no office. Everyone's remote. There's no commute. There's no who didn't clean the coffee maker. There's no sending passive aggressive emails. It's how can I minimum absolutely like any type of employee drama. Like if I can cut it out, I'm going to do it. we lose clients for it. I know, like there's definitely people who want like the old school agency, like Mad Men experience.
Hmm.
Uh, I am glad to just say goodbye to those clients, just so like politics cannot beat its way back into my life. So that's been huge.
Oh my God, just the freedom from that, because drama can just like suck you down on
Yep,
every aspect.
it really
Well,
does, and much more than you realize.
right. Well, especially going through what you've gone through. That's a lot of it all at once too.
Yeah.
So if we're to, highlight one thing that you've kind of talked through, or, one thing that we maybe haven't hit, is there it's something that you leave the listeners with that you want to make sure that you really accentuate?
Yeah, I wouldn't stress too much if you don't really know like where you're going to be tomorrow. It really helps to know, what your business is worth and all of that. But things have a way of working out.
Well said. I think there's a lot of entrepreneurs that's how we live. But knowing the foundation and knowing if something knocks is also, like you said, super important. What you said, you obviously have that stuff readily at hand, so it's important, and that allows you to kind of leave that stress, I think, as well.
Definitely.
What's the best way, Corey, for our listeners to get in touch with you?
Sure. Well, they could find our agency site is northcutt.com with two T's. Also, look me up on Twitter at Corey_Northcutt, Corey. Again, Northcutt. Yeah.
Cool, man. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Corey. Appreciate it.